If you don't know me, I'm Spencer, and I'd like to talk about frugality, simple living, and ways to cut down on your technology usage, sometimes by using other technologies, like the iPod. Let's get into it. The original iPod came out in October of 2001. It wasn't the first MP3 player. There was something that came out of Japan, I think that was the first one. But what it was the first MP3 player that was able to hold 1,000 songs, which was a huge thing at the time. I actually remember my grandma had a really small MP3 player at the time, and I feel like it could only hold like 60 something songs. That was impressive at the time, honestly. So when the iPod came out, it blew that thing out of the water. People were obviously impressed by the iPod, and it wasn't long before it became a cultural phenomenon. And for such a small, unique device, it was also rather long lasting with a 10-hour battery life. But folks didn't really know how long lasting they were truly going to be, because 23 years later, people are still using the iPod today. iPods were huge at the time. It was really spectacular. It was a really crazy thing at the time to imagine being able to hold basically your entire music collection for some people in your pocket. But once the iPhone and other smartphones came out and really came to prominence, they became the de facto way of listening to music on the go, and the iPod just sort of faded out over time. An iPod that looked like this hasn't really been in production for a very long while. They made touchscreen ones for a while, namely the iPod Touch, but even that's gone as well. It was discontinued in 2022. I was honestly kind of surprised that the iPod Touch held on for that long even. But even though the iPod is no longer in production, a lot of people are reaching for these types of devices once again. In fact, there's a decent used market for these, and an iPod like this can actually command a pretty good price, sometimes as much as they cost new. So let's get into the reasons why I think people are choosing to pick up a device like the iPod once again. So the number one reason why I think people are picking up the iPod once again is just because of the nostalgia factor. This was a cultural phenomenon when it first came out. I remember the iPod commercials back in the day, seeing droves of people walking around with those white earbuds when they first came out. My first iPod was the iPod Shuffle, and it was basically just a USB stick with a little controller on it. It had no screen, 512 megabytes I think, which was pretty crazy for me, and I packed tons of my favorite songs on that thing. But people are generally just very nostalgic for the iPod. And of course I understand why. It's a fun device. It has that signature kind of clean Apple interface, and its interface was, I think, crucial for giving that reputation of Apple for having that kind of clean, minimal look. And the body of the iPod also has a very cool look to it. It's got a retro feel, like it obviously doesn't feel like the newest thing ever, but it also just has a way of kind of feeling up to date even though it is an older thing. But that's kind of the effect that Apple has, I think, generally. If you can think of those big Apple desktop computers. I remember somebody I know had one, and it was like green and it was see-through and you could see the components in the back of the computer. That thing is just such a neat looking device. I think there's a lot of people who are my age or older who, grew up with the iPod and they just want to connect with that feeling once again. When I was growing up, I watched a lot of Digimon, and I had a green Digivice that I actually had growing up. But I think people are just nostalgic for simpler tech generally. Things that you might not have even grown up with that you just connect with because it's less connected. And I can relate to that as well because I have a rotary phone and I didn't grow up with a rotary phone. And the fact that I can still use my rotary phone using my Cell 2 jack, I'll link to a video above where I show how I do that. It's really cool. It's cool that certain old devices like this can still be put into circulation and enjoyed. The fact that an old device that kind of harkens back to a simpler time, at least a simpler time in technology, that can still be used today, that's really cool. So it's cool. People are nostalgic for it. So the second reason why I think people are choosing to pick up the iPod once again is people are looking to enjoy music and listen to music digitally, but they want to do it in a way that isn't involving a smart device and the distractions that come along with it. If you want to hear about smart devices and the distractions that come along with it, take a poke around my channel because that's pretty much what I talk about around here. We are increasingly living in what is a smart world. I don't know if that's making us any smarter, but what it is for sure is making us busier, more stressed, and more distracted. If you choose to use an all-in-one smart type device, you're bringing all the distractions that come along with that with you wherever you go. If you just want your phone to come with you on an errand so you can listen to a podcast or listen to some music, you're getting a lot of extra stuff maybe that you don't want with you that is coming on that errand. The ability for people to text you, the ability for emails to bother you, the ability to just pick up your phone and dive into social media. Since the introduction of the smartphone, people have been choosing more and more to use their smartphone as their all-in-one device to listen to music and do a lot of other things. A lot of other things. things. But the problem is those other things can often distract you from doing the thing that you set out to do in the first place. Whether it's compulsively checking your email, doom scrolling on social media, or just being generally distracted by an incoming call or text, a smartphone comes with a lot of asks that you may not always be looking for in the moment. And I mean, of course, you can silence your notifications or you can exercise some level of willpower. A lot of people have suggested that one to me. But when you use something like the iPod, that stuff's just taken out of the equation. And I think that's part of the appeal of using a single-use, more dumb device. It's honestly a smarter option. In line with that, the third reason why I think people are choosing to pick up the iPod once again is just the fact that it does one thing and it does it very well. Storage on phones really varies by model to model. My iPhone only has, I think, 128 gigabytes, but that has to be shared with photos, with podcasts, with other apps, and with music, of course. But my iPod, on the other hand, has 160 gigabytes, and that's dedicated for music alone. That's important because I find with my iPhone that I'm constantly running out of storage because of the photos, because of the podcast, because of the apps that I don't have a problem with on my iPod. The iPod is a dedicated thing that is just there to do music. I mean, it technically can do video, but very few people are doing that at this point. The iPod can handle very high quality music. It isn't the most hi-fi music player out there, but it can definitely play very high fidelity files. The iPod just does one thing, and I think that's significant. It's from a time before everything had a built-in camera in it, before it could do other things like access the internet. It could just do music, and it does that very well. And with 160 gigabytes of dedicated space for music on here, I can put my entire catalog on here and probably everything I'm ever going to listen to, no problem. So the fourth reason why I think people are choosing to pick up the iPod nowadays is just because of the level of third-party support there is for keeping these things working. There's so many different ways that you can modify the iPod to fit your needs specifically. If your iPod's getting a little long in the tooth, maybe the battery's not lasting as long as it used to, or the hard drive's giving you some trouble, it's very easy to find third-party parts to modify these, and there's a lot of support on the internet to do that. There's tons of YouTube channels showing you how to modify these things. You can put the original types of parts back in it, or you can modify it to faster, more modern solutions. Like you can switch out the spinning disk hard drive for micro SD cards or even CF cards. You can put a new battery in it, something higher capacity. You can replace the scroll wheel if that's giving you trouble. You can put a new screen in. I will caveat that this depends on what model you're using. I have the iPod Classic. I think it's the 5th or 6th generation. This is one of the most supported iPods out there, and on eBay there are a ton of parts available. And if you want to get your hands dirty and learn how to do a little bit of electronic repair, you can figure out how to do this yourself with a lot of help that's out there on the internet. Here on YouTube, there's tons of tutorials on how to do these modifications I mentioned, like changing out the screen or changing the hard drive or the battery out in an iPod like mine. There's also tons of alternate plate options for the front and the back plate, the outside case of the iPod, that you can change to fit whatever taste you have. You can go yellow, you can go black, you can go hot pink, or you can bring it back to bone stock if that's your thing. The point is, the support community for these things are huge, and if you get one of the models that doesn't have any of the parts glued to the board, which really makes it impossible to service them, then you're gonna have no problem keeping this thing up to date and working for you. I also don't want to skip mentioning the software changes that you can make as well. If you want to run the original iPod software, that's totally good, but you can also install something on there called Rockbox. Quickly, what Rockbox is, if you don't know, is it's a free open source software replacement that you can install on your iPod to run instead of running your iPod's base software. It allows you to drag and drop your music directly onto the iPod rather than having to sync through Apple's software. So if you're a Windows user, this is probably going to be the easier way to go. My point is that there's a wide array of support for these things, be it with parts, but also with tutorials showing you how to keep these things up to date and functioning. And now my fifth and final reason for why I think people are choosing to pick up the iPod again nowadays is the same reason why people are choosing to pick up things like dumb phones. It's an intentional, almost an act of protest, a step against the way things are going with this increasingly smart world of all-pervasive tech. Obviously, smart devices are pretty cool. It's awesome that something like an iPhone or any other smartphone is basically a little supercomputer that you can carry around with you. But I do think people are getting tired of this increasingly smart world that we're in. It is tiring to kind of be always on because we always have some sort of digital connection with us at all times. Obviously, I think people are picking up things like the iPod and the dumb phones as a way to disconnect from this hyper connectivity that we're living in. But I do think it's also a little bit more than that. It's an act of protest to show that I'm not sure that this is the way that we should be going, this extreme connectivity that we're pushing ourselves towards. And I think people are picking up these things as a little sign that they're not so sure that they want to move that direction either. I know I am. That's about it for today, guys. Just a few reasons why I think people are choosing to pick up something like the iPod once again. It doesn't have to be the iPod. There's tons of good single-use music players out there. I've actually linked a few of them in the description if you're looking to pick one up yourself and you can't quite find one of these bad boys. What do you think about the iPod and its resurgence here in the 2020s? Do you agree with any of my reasons? Are you using the iPod yourself? Or are you happy just sticking with your smartphone, exercising a little bit of extra willpower and enjoying the convenience that comes from an all-in-one device like that? Let me know in the comments section. That's it for today, and I'll see you in the next video.